He was 92 years old and still wore his white coat with pride. That morning, the line formed early. People of all ages wanted to see Dr. Kenji, the doctor many called the town's grandfather. The trouble came with the first appointment, a woman trembling with anxiety, a heavy stomach, and a racing heart. She asked for a strong medicine, something immediate. Kenji took a deep breath, looked her in the eyes, and shared how, years ago, he'd nearly quit practicing because he'd felt that same weight in his body and mind. Instead of leaving the profession, he decided to try a simple change that transformed his life. You're watching the Life Guidance After 60 channel, created especially to offer advice and life stories for those over 60. The turning point started with a detail most people ignore: the temperature of what goes into your mouth. Kenji realized he'd spent his days filling his glass with ice, drinking scalding coffee cooled with cold water, and eating frozen desserts. Everything seemed normal, but his body was paying the price. He flipped the script: warm tea, gentle soups, water at a comforting temperature. Within a few weeks, his belly relaxed, his sleep improved, his mind cleared, and his circulation stabilized. It felt as if his body was saving energy it had previously wasted compensating for thermal shocks. The woman listened quietly, intrigued. Kenji picked up a teapot and poured her a cup of roasted rice tea, neither bitter nor sweet. "Let's start here," he said. She took her first sip and felt her body warm from the inside. Just like that. The doctor explained that when digestion happens with less effort, the body has more energy left over for what truly matters: repairing tissues, strengthening the immune system, preserving memory, and improving the blood that nourishes every cell. What seems small, in practice, puts the whole system back on track. Kenji's story included a wound. At 70, he lost his wife, Aiko, his life partner and clinic companion. Grief drained his spirit. He thought about closing his doors for good. A colleague took him to visit older masters in another city. What he saw there became a turning point: professionals over 90, calm in posture, sharp in mind, conducting appointments full of warmth. They all shared one trait: respect for how they ate. No extremes of cold, no pushing their bodies to the limit. The dining table became a refuge, not a battlefield. He returned home with a personal commitment: to treat food as an ally in healing. He prepared a light broth for dinner, avoided cold drinks even on hot days, and slowed down his midday rush. His memory improved noticeably, and his circulation found balance. The following week, he saw an elderly man who couldn't remember his grandchildren's names. The sight broke his heart. Instead of handing out lists or scolding him, Kenji suggested a ritual: warm family meals, setting down utensils between bites, pausing to breathe. 3 visits later, the man arrived smiling, calling each grandchild by name. His family cried in the waiting room. For Kenji, this was more than just a medical case, it was a rediscovery of the purpose behind his work. Caring for patients wasn't only about prescribing medication. It was about teaching a form of care that fits both your budget and your daily routine. When an older person's mind feels respected, daily life stops being a threat and becomes a space of trust. Love shows up in simple gestures: a cup of tea served with care, a shared bowl of soup, the patience to warm the body from within before asking anything of it. The anxious woman who opened his day returned 2 weeks later. Her dark circles had faded, her hands were steady, and her breathing was deeper. She said she'd swapped her glass of ice for steaming mugs, started warming her lunch, and eating lighter dinners. Episodes of heartburn became rare, her mind felt clearer, and her blood circulation regained its strength. She'd expected a miracle pill; instead, she received a daily practice. And she discovered that was enough to take back control of her own story. Kenji kept a simple notebook in his office with Aiko written on the first page. In it, he recorded small improvements from his patients, as if collecting proof that life can bloom at any age. There were stories of people who started reading for longer periods again, who reconnected with their grandchildren through conversation, who rediscovered the joy of cooking. The common thread tying it all together was the same choice: reducing harm to the body, strengthening the mind, and supporting the organs that keep health in motion. A young resident once asked why these results seemed so consistent. The doctor answered without mystery: when you give comfort to the digestive system, it returns balance to everything else. Then he explained how, by saving energy during digestion, the body redirects that strength toward watching for invaders, repairing tiny injuries, preserving memory connections, and even maintaining better quality blood flow. The resident filed away every word, realizing that science and humanity walked side by side in that clinic. Another case marked that month. A caregiver brought in his father, a kind man, but aggressive at night. Kenji suggested a simple bedtime test: thin soup, warm tea, dim lights, and a short chat. At the next appointment, the caregiver walked in smiling. Nights had grown calmer. The elderly man now fell asleep listening to childhood stories. Memories that had seemed locked away found their way out again. The doctor added another line of hope to his notebook. At the end of the day, Kenji prepared his own dinner: rice cooked with ginger, tender vegetables, and a fragrant broth. A humble meal, made with respect. He glanced at the clock, thought of Aiko, and whispered a quiet thank you. With every spoonful, he reaffirmed the promise he'd made years ago: to keep his mind clear, his heart attentive, his circulation strong, and to keep caring. At that table, no one needed miracles. It was enough to honor the body with choices that warm from within, and life, grateful, responded in kind. At 92, Kenji finished his first morning appointment and adjusted his glasses on his nose. The room was quiet, but he felt the weight of responsibility in every gaze he received. The whole town trusted him because there was something different about the way he lived his life and practiced his work. It wasn't about expensive formulas or miracle pills. The secret lay in small gestures, so simple most people would overlook them. He remembered clearly the day, when he was still young, that he observed a group of elderly masters during a trip to the countryside. Men and women nearing a century of age were still teaching, writing, and seeing patients. None looked exhausted, none seemed frail. What they shared wasn't wealth or technology, but a common habit: respect for how they ate. Kenji stored that scene in his memory like a treasure. Back then, he himself suffered from discomforts that kept piling up in his body. His stomach burned, fatigue was constant, and his mind felt foggy on certain days. That's when he received an unexpected piece of advice: swap cold meals for warm foods and drinks. Tea, soups, broths, everything prepared at temperatures that warmed him from the inside out. At first, it felt strange. After all, who would imagine that vital energy could depend on something so basic? But gradually, he began to feel the effects. He slept better, woke up more refreshed, his mind cleared, and his blood flowed with renewed strength. That simple adjustment opened the door to another realization. He noticed that by sparing his body from thermal shocks, he gained energy for more essential functions: repairing cells, strengthening immunity, preserving memory, and stabilizing circulation. The constant feeling of his body being at war disappeared. It was as if every meal had become a quiet ally in the process of living longer and better. Years later, already known as the town's grandfather, Kenji found himself facing an anxious woman asking for quick fixes. He listened patiently and offered her a cup of tea. She looked skeptical but accepted it. With each sip, her expression softened. Kenji explained that health doesn't start at the pharmacy, it begins with how we care for our bodies every single day. He spoke from his own experience, showing that the mind and circulation stay strong only when the body receives consistent care. His life story was marked by choices like these, small, yet steady. After losing his wife, he sank into grief and thought about leaving his profession. But then he remembered the promise he'd made to himself, to keep alive the purpose of caring, inspired by the masters he'd seen years before. He returned to his kitchen, prepared comforting broths, and reorganized his routine with calmness. His morning turned into strength, and he went back to his clinic with even greater clarity about what he wanted to teach. His patients learned from him that taking care of health didn't have to be complicated. It was enough to drink a glass of warm water upon waking, choose a warm meal instead of a cold one, or have a cup of tea in the late afternoon. Gradually, everyone who adopted this practice discovered something surprising. Symptoms lessened, energy increased, circulation became steadier, and the mind grew clearer. Kenji recorded these accounts in a notebook, as if writing chapters of a shared story. In that clinic, everyone sensed they were in the presence of more than just a doctor. They were with a man who had turned his own journey into a living example. Every piece of advice came with a memory, a real case, a victory won through simplicity. For Kenji, it was clear, longevity isn't achieved through haste, but through discipline, awareness, and respect for the small details that sustain life. And so, as the morning went on, patients waited in line with the certainty they'd receive more than just a diagnosis. They'd receive a fragment of wisdom from someone who had defied time itself, a simple but powerful secret capable of strengthening the mind, improving blood health, and transforming how we approach aging. Kenji often said life gained more color when the plate was filled with colors too. He remembered lunches in Okinawa, where entire families gathered around vibrant bowls, greens, reds, purples, yellows, and whites. It wasn't just about looks. It was ancient wisdom passed down through generations. Each color brought unique nutrients that, together, worked like a silent army against inflammation, memory loss, and even cancer. To an outside observer, it might look like just a beautiful meal. To him, it was medicine served at the table. This habit became even clearer when he visited a 98-year-old woman known for her remarkable mental sharpness. She prepared dinner herself, reciting the saying she'd carried since youth, "Harahachi Biyu, eat until you're 80% full." That simple rule, repeated over decades, kept her body light, her mind active, and her blood flow balanced. Kenji understood it wasn't just about eating less, but about honoring the body's limits. With every meal stopped before fullness, that woman seemed to renew a pact with life itself. During a consultation, a patient once asked if this really made a difference. Kenji told him about recent studies showing this practice activates longevity-related genes, like sirtuins. He explained it plainly, without complex terms, saying that when the body isn't overloaded, it can better defend itself against serious illnesses. The patient fell silent, reflecting on all the times he'd eaten until his stomach hurt. He left determined to try the Okinawan saying. But there was another aspect that fascinated Kenji: fermented foods. Miso, natto, pickled vegetables. These were familiar staples of Japanese culture but often dismissed as old people's food by younger generations. He insisted these foods weren't just tradition, they were a vital source of balance. A healthy gut, he'd say, holds the key to a steadier mind and more efficient circulation. What many called simple food, he saw as natural capsules for a long life. One of his favorite cases was that of a man who suffered from constant irritability, pushing away family and friends. Kenji suggested he add natto to his breakfast and miso soup at night. A few weeks later, the man returned changed, his gaze calmer, his temper less explosive. He even admitted his dreams had shifted. Kenji wrote that story in his notebook, not as scientific proof, but as living testimony that tradition still carried a strong voice. For him, every color, every fermented food, and every spoonful stopped at just the right moment were small agreements with existence itself. There was no luxury, no secret formulas, only respect. The respect of never demanding more than the body could give. And in the end, that was what kept those people walking the streets at 90, even 100 years old, with peaceful smiles, healthy circulation, and eyes that still sparkled as if holding centuries of stories. Each morning, Kenji repeated the same ritual. Before even thinking about opening his clinic, he'd warm a kettle of water. He'd wait until it reached just the right temperature, fill a large cup, and drink it slowly, in silence. This gesture, passed down from older masters, seemed far too simple to explain the vitality of a man over 90. Yet it was precisely in this detail that the secret lay. Warm water awakened the body without shock, stimulated circulation, aided internal cleansing, and cleared the mind. For him, every sip was like sharpening the blade of an instrument that must always be ready. Once, a young patient asked why this mattered so much. Kenji explained that, over his lifetime, he'd noticed excesses always came from haste and carelessness. Warm water in the morning symbolized the opposite: pause, respect, preparation. And it was through this lens that he began to see eating itself as a ritual of order. First came vegetables, rich in fiber and nutrients that formed the body's foundation. Then proteins, to strengthen muscles and sustain energy. Finally, carbohydrates, providing fuel without sudden sugar spikes. This simple sequence, practiced daily, strengthened the mind, balanced the blood, and stabilized the body like fine-tuning the rhythm of a song. The impact went beyond theory. He remembered a woman who arrived utterly exhausted, complaining of constant dizziness. Tests showed nothing serious, but Kenji noticed her eating habits were chaotic. He advised her to reorganize the order of her meals and drink warm water first thing in the morning. 2 weeks later, she returned smiling, saying her mind felt lighter and she no longer faded out after lunch. Small changes, big results. Another case stood out: a retired teacher struggling with diabetes and wild swings in energy. Kenji asked him to follow the eating sequence strictly, with no exceptions: vegetables first, then fish or light meats, and finally rice or pasta. Gradually, his blood sugar spikes decreased, his energy stabilized, and he even returned to writing poetry, a habit he'd long abandoned. When he brought a notebook filled with new verses to show the doctor, Kenji felt he was witnessing something greater than physical health, life reclaiming its purpose, mental clarity, and healthy circulation. These stories piled up in his notebook, where each patient became testimony that longevity isn't built on miracles, but on daily choices. He never promised eternal youth. What he offered was clarity: if we treat the body with order, discipline, and respect, it repays us with vitality, lucidity, and balance. At the end of the day, closing his clinic, Kenji would look at the stack of notes he'd gathered over the years. He realized he'd turned simple advice into a legacy saying that life, even in its fragility, can be extended through wisdom and consistency. That health often hides in small gestures: a cup of warmed water, a colorful plate, a boundary honored. And that the true secret of longevity isn't about defeating time, but learning to walk alongside it, without hurry, without fear. Our channel was created to share guidance and meaningful reflections for those living the best phase of life, after 60. We're still at the beginning of this journey, and we need your support to grow. So please, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and help spread these messages of inspiration.